Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Transformational Credit Union Leadership, a new model for creating a culture that embraces change. We will explore 8 criteria any leader can put to work from the boardroom to the front lines with our guest speaker today, Rich Jones. I want to introduce Rich in just a moment, but first I want to introduce myself to you. My name is Dennis Sullivan, and I am chairman of the National Directors and CEOs Leadership Convention, and we're very proud to bring you this presentation today. As many of you know, we are getting ready to celebrate our 40th anniversary this August in Las Vegas. It is already shaping up to be our biggest and best convention to date. But as part of our commitment to bring you cutting-edge solutions and practical guidance, we're breaking from tradition a bit, and we plan to bring you more guidance throughout the year with webinars just like this one. And of course, you're invited to our full convention, August 1st through the 4th, at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, where we will be sharing even more solutions and guidance like you will hear in just a moment from a terrific lineup of speakers. Our speaker today, Rich Jones, is the author of a new book, Leading to Leadership, a situational primer to leadership excellence. Rich has an impressive background from his days as Senior Vice President of Sales, Marketing, and Business Development with what was known then as Eli Lilly Federal Credit Union and is now known as Elements Financial Federal Credit Union. Rich has more than 3 decades of leadership experience that includes building entrepreneurial cultures within credit unions and other organizations. And as soon as I heard Rich was out with this book, I called him up. I said, Rich, we have to have you on one of these webinars. It's a terrific opportunity to share some of your experience for all of our directors and CEOs who would be interested. I will be your host today. I'll guide the conversation. So we want to first take a look at the first criteria that Rich has outlined. So Rich, you talk about develop a tolerance for risk that is comfortable for you and your staff. Can you talk more about that?
Well, first off, you know, every credit union that I talk to, when I ask the board of directors of the senior leadership what is their risk tolerance, and they always say pretty much uniformly across the board the same thing. And what they say is, we want to be fast followers. And the reality is fast followers is a continuum, and that can mean different things for different people. So I think defining risk tolerance is more about how do you define when you are going to get engaged in a product or service, how early in the development of that product and services are you going to become engaged, and then when are you willing to walk away from that product and service. The whole issue around this is around engaging the employees, so that the staff, and encouraging them so that they in fact see the value of moving forward with new initiatives and encouraging them in that process. Not everybody likes change, so it has to be a process of encouragement so that when change comes to the forefront, and we know we live in a world of change right now, they are in fact ready to embrace that change. So I think encouraging is one way that you've got to get people ready for change and to in fact embrace change when it does in fact happen.
Good. Can you talk a little bit about, on a practical level, how we do that as a director, a CEO, an executive at the credit union?
Yeah, let's talk about first off at a leadership level within the credit union versus in the boardroom. The best way to do that is be present. And what I mean by that is we depend so heavily right now on email, and we do a lot of conversations via email. Sometimes we need to kind of just walk over and talk to somebody face to face when that's possible. Having that engagement. I have a rule that if an email gets iterative and it goes through 2 or 3 or then 4 iterations in conversations back and forth, it's time to get up from your chair and walk over and have that face-to-face. The same thing potentially happens with the board of directors and the CEO. Sometimes they get into conversations and dialogue, and maybe the best thing to do is to pick up the phone and have a conversation instead of trying to manage everything. But through that process, encourage them in the ideas that you want to foster and move forward with. Don't just, in fact, try to sell them on the idea, but encourage them to understand what you're trying to say and search for that point of understanding through encouragement. So I think a lot of it has to be that person-to-person contact versus relying on the electronic channels.
Great point. The second criteria of the 8 that we're going to be talking about You say get others to first seek to understand, not to be understood. Sounds great. How does that actually work in real life?
Well, that takes a keen listening skill. You have to really listen to for understanding and not just listen to response. You, you know, that's a learned skill. We often, especially in the boardroom or even in senior management meetings, we have a tendency to be formulating our own answers before we've heard the other point of view. And so, kind of create that mantra and that belief that you need to listen for understanding before you respond. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be building a response, but make sure you understand fully what the other person is trying to say. Being a listener is a key skill, and you have to listen from the bottom of the organization to the top. I was once told by a very smart CEO that the higher you get in the organizational hierarchy, the less you know what's going on in the front line. And so having those listening tools to hear the voice of those people on the front line, and that kind of really fits into the whole leadership mantra that I try to foster within organizations, and that is what I call leading from your chair. That skill that you can in fact be a leader regardless of what your role is in the organization. If I'm a teller, I must believe that I'm in that position because I'm an expert at that job. And as an expert in that job as a teller, I have a responsibility to have voice in how my job is being done and efficiencies that can be brought to that job. So I can lead. I can lead vertically. I can lead upwardly in that role by making sure that I have a voice, but it requires that those people in leadership positions above you in the hierarchy of the organization are in fact listening to that. So learning to be a leader is a critical element.
Any tips you can give on practicing those listening skills? Anything we can do today to start improving our listening skills?
Yeah, one of the very important things to do is to just pause. We have these learned responses. We're sitting in a meeting, somebody starts talking, and our mind kicks in. Start to recognize that trigger behavior. That okay, I don't agree with this person, so here is my argument back. Instead of going right there, kind of demonstrating a little bit of personal discipline to stand back and listen first before you start to formulate a response. And one of the best ways to do that is learn how to be a very inquisitive listener. Instead of trying to sell them, try to ask them questions about what their position is that will help maybe you understand better what they're trying to communicate, but also help them understand that there may be other ways to do this. So using that questioning skill and learning how to ask smart questions that help to reveal the inside understanding of the person that's speaking is I think, a key important thing. But pause before you speak. Don't always be the first person to answer in the room.
I love this next point, number 3. Know when to shift from your strategic plan in real time and when to cut your losses. That's a tough one.
Yeah, there's a good credit union in Boulder, Colorado, Elevations Credit Union. And when the new CEO came in, what he wanted to do is he wanted to win the Malcolm Baldrige Award for Process Excellence. It's a national award that's actually given by the President of the United States. And so he set that as a mission. Now, this was in 2007. Well, we all know what happened in 2008. And it would have been very easy for that strategy to fall between the cracks of trying to get capital ratios in line, trying to get loss ratios in line, trying to get expense ratios in line, to be lost. But what he was able to do was he's able to kind of shift gears and maybe change the priority level a bit, but never lose sight of that strategic goal. So it's knowing when a strategy needs to be delayed, but equally, by the same process, you've got to know when a strategy is not working because conditions have changed substantially. And when they change substantially, you've got to be able to respond strategically and not just tactically. So go back to that strategic plan, look at what those 4 or 5 key strategic drivers were that you're trying to accomplish, and then say which of these need to be delayed, which of these need to be shelved permanently, but make it a strategic decision instead of quickly falling into that tactical thing. And that's where being nimble is. When I talk about being nimble, it doesn't mean switching tactics necessarily as much as it means to, in fact, be strategically nimble and know when you've got to back off a little bit and delay. For example, this credit union I talked about, it delayed them earning the Malcolm Baldrige Award by about 4 years from what the original plan was. But they never lost sight that the plan was to, in fact, win that award. So being nimble is a way that you can look at your strategies real time, make decisions, and then move forward with the most appropriate action, and then build your tactics behind that.
So Rich, I'm curious with that example you gave, how did the CEO say, we are going to this is still a priority for us, but we're going to delay implementation here? How do you still keep that to be a priority without losing that focus?
Yeah, good point. And it's a matter of really always thinking strategically and not thinking tactically. So if you know that you've got a strategic plan in place, and for example, this one's to win the Malcolm Baldrige, and you knew there were specific milestones in that strategy that had to be accomplished for you to attain that end goal. What you can do is, if you know what those milestones are and those have been identified, then you know that this milestone is not going to get done by this date, and here's why. That's a really important conversation for the CEO to have with the board, because the last thing the board wants to do is miss these key strategic goals. They have to clearly understand why this goal has to be changed. Now, in the case of 2008, I mean, the reason was obvious. The examinations have gotten a lot more stringent, and there was a lot of need to rebuild capital. Capital ratios had gotten weakened. So, you know, that got to be a key driver. But knowing that maybe the milestone gets moved out a year, or 18 months, or 24 months, is a strategic decision, but you still know that that goal is in line somewhere down the future. It's just the horizon got farther away.
I love your 4th criteria, because as leaders, we're always making decisions, and sometimes they're not going to work out. Sometimes the strategic plan or the tactics that we have set are not going to work, and you say number 4 here, own up to our mistakes.
Yeah, you know, and that takes a lot of courage. There's no question that every one of us is going to make mistakes, and to be that kind of leader that humbly announces the fact that I have in fact made a mistake, and that we in fact need to move in a different direction, I think is a key ingredient. I was in charge of a very important strategic project. We redesigned our whole deposit savings portfolio when I was at Elements Financial Credit Union. And you know, it was a strategic project, and it was going to last multiple months to do this as part of a bigger strategic goal, and that is, you know, to improve our net interest margins, obviously. But it was a very important project in this whole strategy. So what I needed to do is I needed to deliver on this thing. And what I found out is I made a very major strategic mistake. And what it did was I launched this new deposit portfolio at the same time that there was another major initiative that had member impact being launched. And I hadn't heard that objection to the delivery date. It was given, I just had not heard it. Being able as a leader to stand up in front of an all-staff meeting and mea culpa to the entire team, and specifically to call out those people that were in fact that I in fact caused great harm to by increasing their workloads, was a very important ingredient. And having that, just demonstrating that humility I think helps to make people, in fact, value your leadership even more because they know that you're not going to do anything that's harm without accepting responsibility for that. So I think humility is a very important ingredient for any leader today and for any board of directors, that we're going to make mistakes. Let's own up to them and let's figure out what we need to mitigate those mistakes. And part of it is to have that covenant between the board and the executive team that when a mistake is made, we have a covenant between each other that we will in fact admit to that, and we will in fact create the mitigation strategies to minimize that mistake. So being humble, I think, is an important ingredient and necessary to make sure that the board and the senior leadership team of the organization are in fact fully transparent with what's going on in the organization.
And I think that ties back to your first criteria where you were talking about be encouraging and encourage risk. Well, if we're encouraging risk, we also have to accept the fact that there may be mistakes along the way. And if the leadership is humble enough to say, hey, we've made a mistake, then you're giving people the freedom to also take risk and make mistakes along the way too. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. You cannot have a risk tolerance inside of a culture unless you're willing to accept mistakes, and that requires humility, and it requires humility on both sides of the organization, both from the governance side with the board as well as on the leadership side of the senior management, and that needs to trickle down throughout the entire organization.
Great. Your next point, talk about be demanding, and it's a big failure for a lot of folks, holding staff accountable without being a jerk. But right now we have a lot of strategic plans that have been done. They're in place, but you make the point that in order for those strategic plans not to be collecting dust on a shelf, that we need to be demanding. Can you talk more about that?
Oh yeah, it's like I mentioned, you know, when I talked about Elevation's Credit Union and them having this goal, and they had these milestones set in place. You know, having a strategic plan is one thing, but having an implementation plan is absolutely necessary to that. But even then, if you have an implementation plan without clearly defining ownerships and expectations, it's going to fail. I was recently doing some strategy work with a credit union, and I asked one of the executives, the VP of lending, who owned the lending budget numbers, not the dollars spent, but those balances to be grown. Who owned that number? And the VP of lending could not answer that question. That was clearly a fail on that organization's part, that they had not clearly defined what the expectations are for that particular job, and they have not placed criteria around those expectations with consequences. So being demanding doesn't mean that you're a bad guy. It's just clearly defining what the expectation is for that employee or that particular business unit, and then helping them understand consequences of them not meeting those goals. Let's make this a performance issue. Let's not make it, you know, a negative, saying if you're performing, here's what you have to do to be considered a performer for us. And so taking those strategies, then defining what the key milestones are as part of that implementation plan, and then holding people accountable to those, then having a methodology to measure so that you know whether they've accomplished those goals or not is critical. You know, this is an important thing I think that the board can do. You know, sometimes the boards have a tendency to kind of get into the weeds and want to manage. Well, if they have worked with the CEO and senior leadership to define expectations, then they don't need to get in the weeds. What they need to do is see, did we hit that milestone? If so, let's celebrate it. If not, why? And I always had that kind of rule that before you miss a goal, you better let me know first. I don't want to find out after the fact. If you're having a problem attaining that milestone, let's figure out what we need to do to either make that happen. Is it a resource problem? Is it a budget problem? What is the problem? And then if that can't be solved with more resource or more budget, or that money, that resource, that budget's not available, how do we need to amend that goal so that it still doesn't detract us from that ultimate long-term strategy we're trying to accomplish? So setting very clear goals and expectations, then monitoring those and making it a performance issue, I think is one of the things a board can do to help them kind of draw out of the weeds and look at it from truly a governance standpoint.
I like your next point, because as leaders, we're often concerned about making decisions, but looking at the results of those decisions. Did it work? Did it not work? But you make the point that we need to understand how our decisions really affect others, especially those on the front lines.
Yeah, like I said very early on, the higher you get in the organization, the less you know what's going on in the front line. And sometimes the board of directors know better what's happening on the front line than the CEO, and because lots of times they are members of the credit union and they're going into the branch and they're seeing the behaviors, they're seeing the service levels and so forth. Whereas often I see CEOs, they never go into a branch. They do everything online. They have the services available at their fingertips. So it's really important to understand what are the problems that business unit is in fact suffering from that is getting in the way of them executing on their goals. So you have to start with empathy. You have to understand what it is that particular position needs or that role needs to be expert in the job they do. And that goes back to the whole thing on listening. If you are listening very clearly to what they're saying from the bottom up and what challenges they're hitting, and you can weed through some of the stuff that's kind of old think versus new think, then you can in fact start to help them attain their goals by giving them the proper tools and resources they need to be successful. Sometimes we make decisions at the senior leadership table or in the board of directors room and don't clearly understand how that's impacting the people on the front line. And I think it's very critical that we in fact have empathy for what they're doing. But also part of leadership is understanding where a person may be in their life today. There are times in our life when what we need to do is just get through today because there's some pressing issues at home or in our life that are going to be a distraction. And so how can we help people kind of manage through when life happens to them to become successful in their job and having that empathy for them? I'm not saying that we don't hold them accountable, like, and demand from them. I'm just saying that we do it with an understanding that sometimes different priorities take over our life, and we need to kind of figure out how we can fit that into our life, and what can I do as a leader in the organization, either on a board level or at a senior management level, to make sure that people are in fact able to deal with what's happening to them that are making them not present at work. They may be at work, but they may not be present in their job. What do we need to do to understand where they are and get them back to where they are present in their job every day?
And number 7, as part of your 8 criteria here, you talk about making decisions, but making tough decisions that could backfire on you and still move forward. How do we do that?
Yeah, I was at another credit union not too long ago, and they had a person who was doing some coding in their business intelligence unit, and he was writing it with some out-of-date code for this new implementation. And when I asked the executive about that, the executive said, "Well, he's going to retire soon." And I said, "Okay, so has he given you a date?" No, he just said he's going to retire soon. And I said, "Okay, here's what you need to do. you need to go to him and you need to ask him for a date, because you cannot have this guy doing an implementation with code that nobody that's coming out of school today even knows how to read, or write to. So you need to cut your losses now, and you need to move forward. I see in credit unions a lot. We have this people helping people mantra, and that's a great thing. But sometimes we kind of go overboard in not making those hard decisions with our staff. And we can perform a better service for our employees if we just make sure that if they're not performing to where we need them to be, that we have the courage to mentor and coach them into the right behaviors. And if they're unwilling to that, help them cut their losses. An employee knows when they're not performing to expectations. They know that, and they're just trying to ride it out. We cannot tolerate, or should not tolerate, that mentality in our organizations. But also it has to be courageous about making decisions. There's a lot of fintech coming around. I see credit unions holding on to bad technology because they've got like a 5-year contract or a 7-year contract, and they're only about 4 years into that contract. Sometimes you need to kind of cut your losses, take your write down, and move to what is going to provide a better value and better service to your members and your staff, and have the courage to say, this was a bad decision, we need to walk away, and being able to have the courage to do that. I see that lacking in a lot of organizations. They're afraid to make some of the harder decisions when it comes to their own people management. One thing that a lot of credit unions struggle with is the time people waste on social media and on their cell phones. And the reality is, at the end of the day, that's not a technology problem, and you can't govern that with technology and by putting rules around it. What you have to do is, that's a performance management problem. We have to mentor our supervisors and our managers on how to manage people to performance and standards, and if they are getting distracted by these other medias, then they need to walk away. They need to be coached.
Great point. So our final criteria here, number 8, we want to motivate others to follow and achieve credit unions, what we're calling the triple crown: a win for your members, a win for employees, and a win for your credit union. Sounds great. How do we do it?
Yeah, one of the skills that I've noticed in all great leaders is they have a way that inspire people to do hard things, to make hard decisions, to step out of their comfort zone, and really that comes from a couple of different techniques. Number one is always having real face-to-face conversations with all your direct reports to make sure that they understand the rhythm, what's in it for me, what's in it for the credit union, and what's in it for our members. They have to understand that all the time, and they have to be reminded of that. So, but when it comes to an organization-wide, how do we put these challenges into a format that inspires people to want to attain those? How can we make these goals something aspirational, exciting, and motivating? It's to paint the picture of what it's going to look like when we accomplish that strategic goal. And it doesn't matter whether it's winning the Malcolm Baldrige, what does that look like for the organization, or something that if we can improve our capital ratio, then we can give back more to our members and to our staff. Things like that. What is it that we can tell them that will help them understand why they need to be as committed to this goal as you, the board, or the CEO, or the executive team is committed to it?
And I love your example talking about WIFM, and for those who aren't familiar with it, WIFM, the most famous radio station in the world, something we should always be asking ourselves, because that's what people that we're talking to are asking. What's in it for me? And what's in it for the members, what's in it for the employees, what's in it for the credit union? That is a game changer. I know I've seen credit unions, organizations who have shifted to that type of thinking and have radically changed their business as a result of it, and getting others to follow that. Rich, this has been terrific. I appreciate you taking the time here. You've given us 8 criteria that any of us can use that we can start putting to work. And I encourage folks to take a look at Rich's book. We have recorded this webinar, and we are going to send out a recording for everybody so that they have it and they can view it. Included with that, we'll also include a link to Rich's book, but you can also find it on Amazon very conveniently. And just a reminder, we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary with the Directors Convention this August. We have a terrific lineup of speakers. It's already shaping up to be our biggest convention to date, and we have a special discount going on right now. I encourage, if you are interested, to take advantage of that before it's too late. That expires at the end of this month, so there's not much time, and you can find us at cudirectors.com. Rich, I appreciate you taking the time today and sharing your thoughts here, and we wish you all the best.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and thanks to the attendees for paying attention.